Hello? Can anyone hear me? Is this thing on? Hello? Hello out there. How is everybody? Hi Sarah. How are you doing? It's good to see you. I haven't streamed in forever, so who knows what this is going to be like. It's also going to be a rather short stream because I have to go pick up Keegan from work. But I really want to finish reading this so we can get to a special Christmas holiday themed story that I would really like to read on stream. So, what is the computer doing? Nope, I don't want to install things. Stop it. Oh, you have been watching Simon and Martina. That's awesome. I'm trying to make sure the frames aren't dropping, but gonna drop a host. Can't really stick around though. Have a lovely stream. That's okay, Terry. Thank you for dropping in and dropping a host. Hopefully, yes. Okay, we get your host alert. Thank you for the host. It means a lot. And I hope you have a good evening. Thanks for dropping by. I'm glad you're watching Simon and Martina. We actually got to meet them a few years ago, and it was fun. And that was when they were living in Korea. Now they live in Japan, but I'm assuming it was before today that I posted a video of theirs. And you've been watching it since then. Question, am I dropping frames for anybody on your end? It looks like my computer's wanting to drop frames, but I'm hoping it won't. I don't know. Okay. Alright, I better get started. Sorry, my nose is kind of sniffy. I may have to go blow my nose, actually. I don't know where we last left off, but apparently we're on chapter 9. And the chapter is called Surprises. I really don't remember what happened, so we're gonna jump in and just see how it goes. Everything with the video seems fine. Okay, thank you. Love their personalities. Their videos are so different. I'll enjoy going through all their travel vlogs. Yeah. Their travel ones are some of the best, and of course, they love food, so their food videos are great too. I'll have to send you some more. Love my favorites. Yeah, the one I posted today was about onsens in Akita Prefecture, which I haven't been to, but I thought it was really cool that they found a bunch of onsens that were fine with their tattoos, so, because you can't find that very often in Japan. Well, it's getting better these days, but anyways, okay, let's go ahead and jump in, and hopefully the frames will cooperate. Dude, I love... It may have been this one that I posted, but their video on Korean... No. Yes? Yeah. They have 2 videos on Korean pizzas, and one's like from 2010 or 11, and then they had an updated one a few years ago, and they're both hilarious. I'm dropping frames, and it's turning red. This computer is getting really old and is slow, so that is really the only reason I can think that I'm dropping frames. Because I only have running what is necessary for streaming. Technically, I don't have to have Discord on, but okay. Yeah, we'll just have to watch it and see what happens. I'm not exactly sure why. Yeah, there it goes again. I don't know. I'll have to, like, work on getting computer upgrades. Basically. Okay. For real this time. Oh, thank you for the host, Timo. Hope you're doing well. Without any further ado, is that the right phrase? I don't know. We're gonna start reading Larkspur Lane. So, Chapter 9, Surprises. As Nancy hit the water, the prow of the speedboat loomed overhead. Swiftly, she put one arm around the floundering child and placed the palm of her hand over Marie's face. At the same time, Nancy plunged below. Down, down, down! The little girl squirmed, but Nancy held her firmly. I don't remember any of this. Looking up through the green water, she saw the black keel of the speedboat whiz past in a froth of bubbles. Instantly, Nancy shot to the surface. Barely 30 seconds had elapsed, but it seemed like an eternity. Sunlight dazzled her eyes as the strong arms of Bess and George reached down and lifted the child to the dock. Marie! Nancy panted. Is she all right? She'll be okay, said George as the child began to cry. Marie swallowed some of the lake, that's all. By this time, the two women had rushed over. Mommy! Cried Marie. Mrs. Eldridge scooped up her small daughter and hugged her. My baby, the woman murmured. As she fondled the sobbing child, she looked at Nancy. How can I ever thank you? Please don't, Nancy replied softly. I'm so glad I was there. I want to do something for you, said the grateful woman. I live in the white cottage at the north end of the lake. Nancy smiled. Perhaps you can, Mrs. Eldridge. I would like to ask you something. Anything, the woman said warmly. Come sit down. She led the girls to the beach chairs and settled down comfortably with Marie on her lap. The little girl had stopped crying and cuddled up drowsily. The girls introduced themselves, and Nancy said, Tell me, are you from St. Louis? The woman looked amazed. Why, yes, I am. How did you know? I've heard that an Eldridge family settled in Missouri many years ago, said Nancy. They were originally from New York. That could have been my husband's people, the woman said, looking puzzled. What's the matter? She added quickly, for there was a strange half-smile on Nancy's face. I just can't believe it, Nancy said. This must be my lucky day. What do you mean? Mrs. Eldridge asked. A short time ago, Nancy began, under rather unusual circumstances, I came into possession of an old-fashioned gold bracelet with a coat of arms on it, which I traced. It belongs to the Eldridges. A gold bracelet? The woman exclaimed, her cheeks flushing. Was there an inscription on it? To my darling Mary from Joe, Nancy replied. The woman grew pale. Where's the bracelet now? Safe in my home in River Heights, Nancy replied reassuringly. It must belong to my husband's Aunt Mary, Mrs. Eldridge exclaimed. How did you get it? As Nancy told the story, the woman listened intently, then said, I must call my husband at once. She explained that he was in Richmond, Virginia, searching for his aunt. She's been missing since early spring. Our aunt is a very wealthy woman, rather eccentric at times. Several months ago, she disappeared from her home, leaving a letter. It said she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and was going to a sanatorium for a long rest. Aunt Mary asked us not to try finding her. I'm sure she's being held not far from here, Nancy said. I too am trying to find her. And Nancy will, George declared. She and Bess told Mrs. Eldridge of their friend's success as an amateur detective. Miss Drew has already done me one great service, Mrs. Eldridge said with a smile. She shifted the drowsy child to her shoulder and rose. I can never thank you enough, she said as she started to leave. Suddenly, Mrs. Eldridge stopped and looked back. I forgot to tell you, Aunt Mary has a necklace which matches the bracelet. She wore the set almost constantly from the moment Uncle Joe gave it to her 60 years ago. "I'm glad you told me," said Nancy. "It may be a helpful clue." As Mrs. Eldridge walked away, Nancy said to her friends, "This has been a day of surprises." George grinned. "You haven't seen anything yet." She pointed out to the lake. "Take a look at that!" A long canoe with 3 young men was heading toward shore. A shrill whistle split the air as one of them waved. "Ned!" exclaimed Nancy. "And Bert and Dave," Bess added. "That was our secret." "The boys called us last night," said George, "and when we told them we were coming here, they decided to paddle over today. Ned wanted to surprise you, Nancy." "He certainly did, and it's a grand surprise," she said with a broad smile. The canoe grated ashore, and the 3 athletic-looking boys jumped out. All wore dark blue Bermuda shorts with white shirts bearing the name Camp Hiawatha. "Here we are!" Husky blonde Bert Eddleton exclaimed with a grin. "The world's greatest camp counselors." He was George's special friend. Dave Evans was a rangy boy with fair hair and green eyes. Ned Nickerson, who was tall and handsome, grinned. "Now with us at the lake, you girls can have some excitement." George and Bess burst into laughter, and even Nancy had a chuckle. "Nancy's way ahead of you today," said George. "She usually is," Ned remarked. "Tell us about it. More mystery?" "2 of them," said George, "and a rescue." Walking up the hill to the Cornings' house, Nancy told the boys all that had happened, passing lightly over the speedboat episode. Ned gave a low whistle. "You're on two dangerous cases, I'm afraid, Nancy." "Don't forget you can count on us," Bert said as they entered the utility room. Through an open door straight ahead, they saw Mrs. Corning in the kitchen. She was happy to meet the boys, and at once invited the 3 couples to the yacht club dance across the lake the next night. "My husband and I belong, and would love to have you go as our guests." "I'm sure we can get time off from our camp duties," said Ned. "We'll accept. Thank you." Presently, the boys said goodbye. "We have to get back to our young charges," Dave remarked. "See you tomorrow." The girls dressed quickly and helped their hostess prepare a dinner of steak, potatoes, green beans, and watermelon. Afterward, they insisted upon tidying the kitchen without her assistance. It was twilight by the time they finished. Nancy excused herself and slipped out the front door. Carrying a flashlight, she headed for the spot in the woods where she and Helen had seen the blue fire. After examining the singed leaves, Nancy concentrated on the ground beneath them. There were some bits of scorched brown wrapping paper. Picking them up, she wondered if they might help to explain the fire display. Nancy then hurried to her room and put the pieces away in an envelope. "Maybe Ned can analyze them," she said to herself. "I'll check with him tomorrow night." Though the group watched intently, the blue fire did not appear that evening. Before going to bed, Nancy told the Cornings that she was afraid Morgan might have been kidnapped. "Perhaps you ought to inform the police." Mr. Corning shook his head. "Morgan asked us not to," he said. "I'll give him another 36 hours. Next day there was still no sign of the missing houseman, and Nancy asked for permission to search his room. "Go right ahead," said Mrs. Corning. It was an attractive room with a large window overlooking the lake. Quickly and efficiently Nancy searched, but could find no clue to the man's whereabouts. She observed that the servant could leave the house by going through the utility room and out the side door without anyone seeing him. "Has he a key to the doors?" Nancy asked Mrs. Corning. "Oh, yes. He usually came and went by the side door so he wouldn't bother us." "Did he have many friends?" Nancy inquired. "None that we know of. He was a quiet man and liked to stay by himself." Nancy looked thoughtful. "The friendship card Morgan received makes me feel that an old acquaintance is after him for some reason. There may be a clue to this person in his references. If you still have them, may I examine the letters?" Mrs. Corning was not sure where the papers were. "I'll look for them tomorrow." After lunch, Nancy, Bess, and George drove to the eastern outskirts of River Heights to search for the Larkspur house. They were riding along a shady country road. Nancy stopped in front of a small home where a woman was trimming the hedge. Under a nearby tree sat an old lady shelling peas. "Excuse me," said Nancy. "We're trying to find a large house in this area that has lots of larkspur or bluebells around it. Do you know of such a place?" "Can't say I do," the woman replied. "What'd she say?" Wait, there were 2 women? I'm confused. Oh. Can't say I do, the woman replied. What'd she say? The old lady asked loudly. Nothing, Mother. Just some house they're looking for. She's deaf, the woman added to Nancy. I heard that, the mother said tartly. And I heard house and bluebells. They're looking for the bluebell house, and I know just where it is. End of chapter 9. I had to put in some kind of accent there. Hi Timo, how are you? It's been so long since you've read this book. I can't remember if I've read it. I don't know that I have, but like I said, I can't remember anything now because it's been so chopped up, my reading of it on stream. And I realized I need to update my background pictures because they're still fall and it's getting cold and it's near Christmas, so I need to update my backgrounds to be holiday stuff. Thank you for liking my little old lady voice. I tried. Okay. Continuing with chapter 10, An Unwelcome Gift. You girls, listen to me. Oh, sorry, I changed the voice. You girls, listen to me, the old lady shouted. The house you want is over in the next township, just outside of Milford. Go right down Elm Road, you can't miss it. The woman standing by the hedge shook her head. I never heard you mention that place before, Mother. The old lady's black eyes snapped. I know lots I don't tell, she said. The girls thanked the two women and drove off, excited at the lead. But as they neared the small town of Milford, Bess looked worried. I'm beginning to wish I'd stay home, she said. I really don't want to meet any kidnappers. Now don't be a snob, George teased her cousin. It's all right for you to make jokes, Bess replied, but I can't help it if I'm not brave like you two. Nancy smiled. I can remember times on some of my cases when you were way ahead of us. I surprised myself, Bess admitted. Nancy spotted the sign marking Elm Road and turned into the narrow, treeless street. There it is, exclaimed George. In the middle of the block was a yard full of bluebells. You mean there it isn't, Nancy said gloomily as she pulled up in front of the white cottage. A faded sign, Bluebell House, hung by the door. No mansion, no fence, no gate. But whoever lives here must be interested in bluebells, said Bess. Maybe they could help you. Good idea, Nancy said, and the three girls went up the walk to the door. Their knock was answered by a thin young woman wearing an apron. Hello, girls, she said cheerfully. I guess you want to see the china. Come on in. She walked quickly into a room off the hall, beckoning them to follow. Nancy tried to explain, but stopped short at the door of the room. Shelves and tables were filled with flowered china. All hand-painted, the girl said. The prices are marked. Oh, how beautiful, Bess exclaimed. While she and George looked around, Nancy explained to the girl why they had called. There's no place like that around Milford, she said. But have you tried the Brookdale section west of River Heights? I've heard there used to be lots of estates out that way. Nancy thanked her, and Bess bought 3 hand-painted cups and saucers. There's one for each of us, she said when they reached the car. A souvenir of a wild goose chase. It may not have been so hopeless after all, said Nancy, and repeated what the girl had said. George looked thoughtful. You told us Dr. Spire rode about an hour to get to the house. Can't we narrow the search by going only to places that are about an hour from the road where the old sedan was parked? We could, Nancy said, but the chances are that the kidnappers drove a little longer than necessary just to confuse the doctor. George grinned. Nancy, you never miss a trick. A further search continued for some time, but without success. Finally, Bess reminded Nancy of the dance that night. We'd better go home, she advised. Hours later, Nancy was seated with Ned on a bench outside the gaily lighted porch of the yacht club. Lively music and singing came pulsing out the wide-open doors and windows. On a hunch, I brought something for the chemistry expert, she said, and handed him the envelope containing the bits of paper she had picked up in the woods. I'm no expert, he protested. Ned's eyes filled with mischief. You don't expect me to look at this, do you, when I could be looking at you? Nancy blushed and laughed. She was wearing a simple rose-colored formal, and her hair was piled high with a gardenia tucked in it. Please be serious, she said. I have a hunch that the burning circle is made of fireworks, which are carried by someone. I remember that you once helped make a fireworks display at college. Ned spilled the bits of paper into his palm. He looked at them carefully. Your hunch is right, Nancy. These are fragments of quick match. What's that? She asked. The fuse which is used to light fireworks. He explained that it was a string coated with a mixture of gunpowder and glue and enclosed in a brown paper tube. Then that's attached to the lances. And what are they? Nancy queried. Paper tubes filled with chemical mixtures which burn different colors. The circle you saw is probably a wooden frame with long nails sticking out of it about an inch apart. The lances are forced upright onto the points of the nails. Then the quick match is nailed across the tops of the lances. It's rough to do, he added, because the lances are very hard, and many times the nail goes into your finger instead. Well, does that help you? Yes, if I can find out where the fireworks were bought, and by whom, I may have a good lead. The rest of the evening was pure fun and ended with supper on several of the members' yachts moored to the club's dock. While taking their dates home, the three boys invited them to a swimming meet at the camp the next afternoon, and the invitation was accepted. By 1 o'clock, the girls were ready for bed. Bess and George dropped off to sleep at once, but Nancy lay awake. Suddenly, she sat up. There had been a noise downstairs. Quickly, she put on a robe and slippers, then grabbed a flashlight from her suitcase. Slipping past her sleeping friends, Nancy went quietly down the back stairs. At the bottom, she heard a scraping sound in the utility room. Softly, she opened the door and flashed on her light. Caught in the beam was a white-faced, frightened figure on his hands and knees. He looked up. The missing man. Morgan! Nancy exclaimed. What are you doing? Where have you been? I dropped the door key, he stammered. Nancy spotted the key and picked it up. Thank you. I was moving things, feeling around for it. Sorry I disturbed you. Morgan, we've been very worried about you, Nancy said. Won't you please tell me what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, the man said quickly. I'll explain in the morning. He opened the door to his bedroom, stepped inside, and locked the door behind him. Nancy wondered if she should waken her hostess to report the servant's return, but decided against this. In the morning before breakfast, Mrs. Corning told the girls Morgan had already talked to her and her husband. She said he had begged for forgiveness and had told a rambling story about going to help a friend. I'm afraid it's not true, but we don't want to discharge him, she sighed, then said, Here, I almost forgot. She handed Nancy the names of the 3 persons who had written letters of recommendation for the houseman. If you don't mind, said Nancy, I'll phone these men after breakfast. An hour later, she came down from the second-floor phone and reported to the Cornings in the living room. Well, what did they say? Asked the old gentleman. None of these people ever heard of Morgan. The couple sat thunderstruck. Here's an illustration. This says, Morgan, Nancy exclaimed. What are you doing? He's all on all fours. It's kind of weird. Then the letters were forged, said Mrs. Corning. I'm afraid so, Nancy told her. Impossible, snorted Mr. Corning. I remember talking to one of those men on the telephone. You must have spoken to an imposter, said Nancy. But why would Morgan do this? Asked Mrs. Corning. Maybe his past made it impossible for him to get recommendations any other way, said Nancy. Whoever helped him must feel he has a hold over Morgan. Perhaps that is the friend who has come back into his life. Mrs. Corning said presently, Now that Morgan has returned, maybe it's all over. I doubt it, said Nancy. He's still frightened. Her host spoke up. Morgan's always been honest, and a hard worker. I say we give him another chance. Do you agree, Emily? His wife nodded. The girl said nothing. After church and lunch, Nancy looked through the advertising pages of the telephone directory for fireworks companies in the area, but found none. As she put the book away, there was a sharp knock on the front door. Nancy went to open it. No one was there, but on the stoop was a long, narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to Morgan. Suspicious, Nancy went to tell the Cornings about it. "Under the circumstances," she said, "would you like to open this before Morgan does?" "No," her hostess said firmly. I feel that what's Morgan's business is his business. Take the parcel to him, Nancy." With misgivings, she carried the package to the kitchen and handed it to the houseman. He stared at it and began to tremble. With shaking fingers, Morgan removed the string and paper. He seemed lost in thought and unaware that Nancy was still in the room. When Morgan opened the paper and saw the contents, his face turned white and he suddenly slumped to the floor. In the package lay a few stalks of blue larkspur. Into chapter 10. Welcome for joining, CJ. How are you? Welcome for saying shut up to Ned. Another candidate for the suspect list. Yep. To those of you who got here recently, I'm just kind of going through quickly because this is going to be a short stream. So I'm going to continue reading, and thank you for being here. Doing my best. Okay. That sounds good. Also, I realized I never answered your message on Discord, so I still need to do that. I'm not sure when I'll get to it, but I remember that it's there. So, I haven't forgotten. Okay, chapter 11. A hazardous drop. Quickly, Nancy knelt beside the unconscious servant. "Morgan," she said urgently, and lightly slapped his cheek. He did not stir. She wet a clean towel at the sink and patted his face. A few moments later, he moaned and muttered, "Last warning, tomorrow night." Then his eyes opened, and with Nancy's help, he managed to sit up. She called the others, and while Mrs. Corning telephoned the doctor, the girls assisted the man to his room. Mr. Corning seated himself beside the bed, but Morgan would speak to no one. In a short time, Dr. Bennett, an old friend of the family, arrived. He said the houseman had suffered a slight heart attack and ordered him kept quiet. That means no questions, Nancy thought. She had been mulling over the significance of the larkspur in the package. She put them in a vase. When the doctor had gone, she led the rest of the group into the living room and told the whole story. "Larkspur again?" exclaimed George. "I don't get it." "That's one of the clues in your other case, Nancy," Bess said, puzzled. "Probably the two are connected," the young sleuth replied. She told the Cornings briefly about Mary Eldridge. Bess looked surprised. "Why, what can Morgan have to do with the old lady's kidnappers?" "But Morgan has always been the soul of honesty," protested Mrs. Corning. "Perhaps not always," Nancy said gently. "I believe he may have a prison record, under another name, of course. It would explain why he needed forged recommendations. Now, Adam Thorne wants repayment." "Adam Thorne?" exclaimed George. "Why him?" "Because all the years Morgan worked for the Cornings, no one bothered him, but after Adam Thorne broke out of prison, the friendship card arrived and the blue fire began." Mr. Corning stirred uneasily. "You spoke of repayment. What did you mean?" "I think Thorne and his gang want to rob this house. Remember, the friendship card had no written message on it, but the picture showed a cottage with the door open." "I see," said Bess. "That was the message. Open the door." Mrs. Corning was pale. "Do you know when it is to be?" "Tomorrow night, I think," replied Nancy. "I believe the larkspur was a signal to Morgan, his last chance to cooperate. Probably the gang showed the blue fire and abducted Morgan to intimidate him." Mr. Corning's face flushed with anger. "Scoundrels! We'll get the police at once." "Wait," said Nancy. "This is only a theory. If we hold off until tomorrow night, we'll see if we're right. Maybe we can catch the thieves red-handed and solve both cases at once." "But in the meantime," George said worriedly, "Morgan may have told the gang where you are." Nancy nodded. Yes, I've thought of that. When Mr. Drew telephoned her a few minutes later, he had disquieting news. The lawyer had reported to the police before flying to Chicago and asked them to keep in touch with him. Lieutenant Mulligan informed me they had not been able to trace the kidnap car. Also, when they arrived at the Tucker estate, it was deserted. The gang took the pigeons. I understand, Dad. My visit forced them to run. They'll be more eager than ever to get me out of the picture. An hour later, Nancy, Ned, and their friends were watching the swimming races at Camp Hiawatha. In the fun and excitement, she found it hard to remember the threat of danger. Cheers and singing filled the air as the young campers put all their high-spirited enthusiasm into the contests. When the swimming meet was over, she said, "It was great, Ned. Your little boys did so well." "Thanks," he said proudly. "Now we can go swimming. Bert and Dave and I have free time." The boys showed their guests where to change into suits they had brought, then met them at the water's edge. Tons of ocean sand had been transported overland to make a beach for the camp. A float was moored a few rods from shore with a tower and springboard for diving. The three couples swam out to the float, on which a dozen young people were frolicking. Ned introduced everyone. "Oh, you're the detective," said one boy, playfully shielding his face with one arm. Nancy laughed. "I promise not to delve into any of your secrets." George called, "But watch out, my friend." Suddenly Ned asked, "How about a little diving?" One by one, the group went off the high board. Presently, it became an impromptu meet. Nancy, show them that new one you just learned," Bess urged. "I'll try," she smiled, "but I may flop." As everyone watched, Nancy balanced upside down on the edge of the board for a breathtaking moment, then thrust herself off. Her body revolved in the air and straightened out so that her pointed toes cleaved the water like a knife. Down she plunged into the green waters of the lake, then bobbed to the surface to hear the cheers of the spectators. "Wonderful! Perfect!" Panting, Nancy climbed back onto the float. As she threw herself down in the sun to rest, Ned came over. "That was a beauty, Nancy." "Just luck," she insisted. Later, when Nancy swam ashore with her friends, she was met by Mr. Dennis, the camp director. "Great diving exhibition, young lady. How would you like a job as a counselor?" "Thank you," Nancy said, smiling, "but I already have a job." "Well, you and your friends stay to dinner," the man said cordially, "and the evening camp." As he walked away, a bugle sounded. We fellows must go now," said Dave, "but we'll take you home tonight after taps." Nancy called Mrs. Corning to tell her they would not be home for dinner, then the girls went to the guest dining hall. During the meal, two small boys appeared at their table with their arms full of parkas. "Ned and Dave and Bert sent you their coats," piped the tallest. "'Cause you didn't bring yours," said the other. They put the jackets on an empty chair and fled as the girls thanked them. It grew chilly after dinner, and the trio were glad to put on the parkas and pull up the hoods. George flapped her dangling sleeves. "What a great fit this is!" "Now you can't tell us apart," said Bess. When it was dark, a long line of singing boys filed up a hill behind the camp. The girls followed their bobbing flashlights. At the top, the three stopped to look around. The wooded hill sloped steeply to a rocky drop-off. 15 feet below it was a huge bonfire. The girls watched the campers wind slowly down the path and saw that the first ones were already seated on another slope to the far side of the fire. "Come on," said Nancy, "but watch your step." She went first, with George beside her and Bess on the right. As they picked their way downward, they could hear the giant blaze crackling. Smoke billowed up, and Bess paused, coughing. Suddenly, a powerful push from behind knocked Bess off her feet. Screaming, she began to roll down the hill toward the drop-off and the leaping flames. End of chapter 11. Thumbs up. Always with the cliffhanger endings. Oh, you guys, on the way to my job interview today, it started snowing. And it's not supposed to snow until like Friday, I don't think. But, yeah. So, it was kind of exciting. But, I mean, it was real small and it was spitting and it wasn't like, it wasn't sticking, but it was pretty cold. Boo. Well, we didn't really get snow. It was just kind of happening. Polar opposite reaction. Yeah. Well, they get it all the time in New York, so CJ's used to it, but we don't get it very often in Oklahoma, so it's usually, I don't know, I like it because it's different and it's pretty and I don't get to see it very often, but so I'm kind of excited for this weekend. I hope we get snowed in, but yeah. And it's an excuse to like not go anywhere or do anything. And I just like staying home. So, okay. Chapter 12, The Crystal Garden. Bess! George exclaimed, horror-stricken. She'll roll into the fire! Nancy scrambled down the hill, George beside her. With a flying leap, she threw herself on Bess and stopped her from rolling. At the same time, George skidded down and caught one of her cousin's flailing arms. The girls lay gasping, only a few feet from the drop-off and the bonfire below. Bess, Nancy whispered, are you hurt? No, Bess said shakily. Oh, Nancy, somebody pushed me. If you and George hadn't... Nancy looked grim. I think someone mistook you for me, and I don't want him to know he was wrong. As she spoke, 3 counselors hurried down the hill toward them, calling, What happened? Anybody hurt? Nancy squeezed George's hand. We'll pretend I am, she whispered, then closed her eyes. Yes, George called out. Nancy Drew, please hurry. I'm afraid it's bad. She's unconscious, quavered Bess. Moments later, a husky counselor was carrying Nancy up the hill while one of his companions ran ahead for the camp door. And get Ned Nickerson, George called. 40 minutes later, Ned tenderly placed Nancy on the Corning's living room couch as Helen's grandmother closed the draperies. Okay, said Ned, all clear. Only then did Nancy open her eyes and sit up. You're some actress, young lady, said Mr. Corning. Nancy smiled. I didn't have to do anything. Ned and Bess and George were the real actors. Bess giggled. And the camp director and the doctor were good actors too. Mr. Dennis insisted that we use his station wagon to bring Nancy home. I just hope we fooled the one who pushed Bess, said Nancy. Morgan must have told the gang you were here, said George, and one of them trailed us to the camp, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Ned frowned. Someone probably is still watching this house. To make our act look really good, we ought to call the doctor for Nancy. Mrs. Corning hurried off to put in the call. Soon she returned, and she reported that Dr. Bennett would be glad to cooperate. Nancy chuckled. We'll make the gang think I'm out of action. Then they'll pay no more attention to me, and I can work freely. George spoke up. I have a suggestion. If someone is watching this house, he'll probably plan to speak to Morgan. How about Bess and me letting ourselves out the back door and watching? I'll do it, Ned offered. No, Mr. Corning said. That would look too suspicious. I often take a little stroll outside before going to bed. In a few minutes, one of you can follow me. While I'm out there, no gangster will come to talk to Morgan through the window. He waved aside objections and left the room. His wife said worriedly, Oh, I hope everything will be all right, but suppose they strike here tomorrow night. I have a plan, Nancy replied. If Ned and Bert and Dave will help us. Sure we will, said Ned. It's not our night off, but I know 3 fellows who will switch with us. The thieves probably will go for the safe, said Bess. Mrs. Corning shook her head. I'm afraid they're after something very special. Come, she added, seeing the questioning expressions of her guest. I'll show you. As their hostess led the way down the hall, Nancy quietly outlined her plan to Ned. I'll tell the others later. Across the hall from the kitchen, Mrs. Corning opened a door and flicked a wall switch. The room remained dark, but at the far side, a tall glass cabinet lighted up. Bess gasped. Oh, how beautiful! She and the others stared, amazed. Inside was a sparkling array of crystal flowers and butterflies set on shelves lined with black velvet. My husband gave me one on each of our wedding anniversaries, Mrs. Corning explained as she led them to the case. They're made in France. Every flower contains at least one valuable jewel. Nancy noted a ruby glowing in the heart of a rose, and a topaz set in a daffodil. The butterflies had diamonds for eyes. How could the thieves have heard about these? George asked. My crystal garden was written up in a magazine some time ago, Mrs. Corning replied. Nancy examined the case carefully. Do you have a key for this? Mrs. Corning showed her a tiny gold one, which she wore on a chain around her neck. Just then the doctor arrived. He listened to the story of what had happened, then went to check on Morgan, who was much better. When leaving, Dr. Bennett called back through the open door for the benefit of any outside listener. Miss Drew must remain in bed for at least 48 hours. Ned followed the doctor and went to join Mr. Corning. Inside the house, Nancy said to her friends, Dr. Bennett played his part well. Then she told them her plans for the next day. Half an hour later, Mr. Corning and Ned reported no prowler near Morgan's window. Ned said good night and returned to Camp Hiawatha. Shortly before dawn, Nancy ate a light breakfast, then slipped into the garage and hid behind the front seat of her car. At 8 o'clock, the other girls came out with a packet of sandwiches. George took the wheel and they drove off. When she was sure they were not being followed, George pulled to the side of the road and Nancy took the driver's seat. Now for the Larkspur house, she said happily. But where is it? Bess asked. Nancy said that since the Tucker estate lay southeast of River Heights and the Pigeon and Airplane both flew over it, the other headquarters were probably to the northwest. I'll try that anyway. After a while, the road narrowed and there were no houses to be seen. The countryside was generously sprinkled with patches of woodland and open fields. The girls explored every side road. Most of these were merely lumber trails which ended within a short distance. At other times, the searchers found a cabin and inquired if there was a sanatorium in the neighborhood. The answer was always no, and again Nancy would go on. Stopping only to eat their sandwiches, the girls rode all day, exploring the network of winding lanes. All three were tired, their nerves tense with the strain of being constantly on the alert. Finally, Nancy glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10 minutes past 5, she said. We'd better go back. Nancy turned the car and began retracing the route to the main highway. Suddenly, she pressed down on the brake and they stopped short. Sorry, Nancy said, but we just passed a sign that I didn't see when we drove along here before. She backed a dozen feet and halted opposite a narrow dirt road. Nailed to a tree was a crude hand-lettered board, L.S. Lane. What about it? Bess asked. That probably leads to the cabin of a lumberman whose name is L.S. Lane. And on the other hand, said Nancy, it could mean Larkspur Lane and be a guide for the crooks. It's worth investigating, George remarked. Nancy turned into the narrow roadway, wide enough for only one car. But here and there the side bank had been cut to allow a vehicle to park while another passed it. Proceeding cautiously over ruts and bumps, Nancy presently pulled into one of the wider places on the right. She stopped the car close to the trees. This might be the right place, so we'd better go on foot, Nancy said. She led the way among the trees, keeping parallel with the road. The girls trudged through the underbrush for nearly a quarter of a mile, but saw nothing unusual. The only sounds were the crackle of twigs breaking underfoot. Suddenly, Nancy halted. Look, she exclaimed softly. Larkspur! A dozen yards ahead, the trees ended. Just beyond was a high wire mesh fence. Inside it grew a long border of exquisite tall larkspur. To the girls' left, a large gate across the lane shut off the entrance to the grounds. Next to it stood a small brown lodge. This is it, Nancy whispered gleefully, and her friends nodded. Beyond the gate, the ground sloped gently. A gravel roadway led to the top of the rise, where a large white colonial dwelling with a broad veranda was visible among some trees. It's a beautiful place, Bess said in a low voice. I can't believe crooks live here. We'll soon find out, said Nancy. Cautiously, the three girls moved forward, taking advantage of every tree trunk and bush for concealment. There was no sign of habitation. If anyone was inside the gatehouse, he was not to be seen at that moment. Then, for an instant, a flash of light appeared in the distance near the brow of the hill. "Did you see that?" George whispered tensely. "I'm sure it was a nurse's uniform." "Listen! Do you hear a plane?" Nancy asked. The girls peered upward. Several minutes passed before the aircraft became visible. Then it shot overhead, flying low. "It's the same type of plane that wounded the bird," Nancy said quickly. "And it's like the one the hotel manager said flew into the Tucker estate." "Yes, there is that flying horse on the fuselage. This is the place." "Sure enough," said George. "Down he goes. The landing field must be behind the house." The plane dipped low, lost altitude rapidly, and vanished behind the roof of the mansion. "Now what do we do?" Bess asked. "There's only one thing left," Nancy answered. "Somehow we must get inside." Okay, end of chapter 12. Wondering if I can do one more chapter. But I also wondering how many... Oh, that's not that long. How many chapters we have left. Yeah, okay. I'll go one more chapter. I'm sort of vaguely remembering this. I'm vaguely remembering the plot of the book. I'm probably gonna have to go back and reread this because I don't remember the beginning of the book, other than pigeons. Okay. Chapter 13. Baiting a Thief. Thank you, Timo. Sorry, I kind of swallowed wrong. Thank you for the bits. I appreciate the bits. I do need more bits. Well, nobody has to give bits. I'm just saying, what am I saying? I need bits to, make that, requirement of affiliates. To not have to pay a charge, basically. Hi, Joni. How are you? Good to see you. Welcome for cheering. Okay, one more chapter. George frowned. "You're not gonna try getting into this place now, are you?" "No," said Nancy. "I'd probably end up a prisoner." She thought of the old lady who was being held against her will. "It's getting late," Bess put in. "We'd better go back to the Cornings." "Yes," Nancy agreed reluctantly. "We have our work cut out for us tonight." "Why don't you just tell the police where the sanatorium is?" Bess asked nervously. "Let them rescue Mrs. Eldridge." Nancy shook her head. "We must get her to safety before the police raid starts. Otherwise, the gang might harm the poor woman to keep her from talking. We'll have to find out exactly where they're keeping her prisoner in the mansion." "It's such a big house," Bess said gloomily. "Mrs. Eldridge might be hard to find." "It's also possible she's not here anymore," George said. "The gang knows the police are after them, and they may have moved her." When they reached the car, Nancy hid in the back again, and George drove. At the Cornings, Bess was asked to go in first and make sure Morgan was in his room. "No use having him learn my secret," Nancy remarked. "Thorne might get it out of him before I'm ready to have it known." Learning the coast was clear, she scooted up to her room. Mrs. Corning had dinner ready, so a tray was prepared for Nancy. The others ate in the dining room, then went upstairs. "Now tell us your plan for capturing the thieves if they come," Mr. Corning urged. Nancy said, "Here it is. First, remember that the Crystal Garden Room has 2 doors, one to the hall, the other to the TV room. Each has a key that's now on the inside." Her host nodded. Nancy went on. "The boys will be outside. Dave will be watching in the shrubs bordering the flagstone area, Bert at the top of the patch, which leads to the dock, and Ned on the garage roof. As soon as the thief, or thieves, enters the house, Ned will signal with a walkie-talkie to Mr. Dennis at the camp, and he'll call the police. Meanwhile, Bert and Dave will be ready to tackle anybody watching on the outside. We girls will lock any intruders in the crystal room." "But suppose they see you?" Mrs. Corning asked. They won't, said Nancy. Bess and George will hide across the hall in the kitchen. I'll be in the TV room. As soon as the thieves enter, I'll lock the adjoining door. At the same time, the girls will slip across the hall and quietly lock the door. Mr. Corning asked what he and his wife should do. I suggest you go to your room as usual, Nancy replied. That will cause less suspicion. At 9 o'clock, the lights were put out on the first floor. The couple retired, and the girls took their posts. This is reminding me of Home Alone. Nancy held the door to the crystal room open a crack, put the key on the outside of the lock, and watched. It seemed that she stood for ages before the other door opened. There was a click, and the light went on in the glass cabinet. Nancy gripped the key, ready to shut the door. Suddenly she froze. Only one figure approached the cabinet. Morgan, a thief. He was carrying a large suitcase, which he put on the floor. Nancy watched, hardly daring to breathe, as he took a small tool from his pocket and picked at the cabinet lock. A few minutes later, he pulled the glass door open. Then he swung back the lid of the suitcase. Nancy saw that it was divided into compartments and heavily padded with velvet. A special carrying case, she thought. As the man's trembling hands reached toward a fragile crystal flower, he suddenly drew back. No, he whispered hoarsely. I can't do it. He buried his face in his hands with a sob. Nancy hurried to his side. Morgan, she said softly. The man whirled and gave a gasp. Don't be afraid, she said quickly. Let me help you. He groaned and sank into a chair beside the cabinet. How can you know all this? I know part of it, she replied. Where's the gang? You were to let them in, weren't you? The man stared at her, amazed. Yes, but Thorne changed his mind. He said I should steal the crystal flowers and deliver them in this special case he gave me. I used to be pretty good at lockpicking, he added, flushing miserably. That's how Thorne got his hold over you, isn't it? Asked Nancy. He knew you'd been in prison, and he helped forge your references. The houseman nodded. I wanted to go straight, and I did. I wouldn't hurt the Cornings for anything. But Thorne, he wouldn't leave me alone. Kidnapped me, held me on a big estate. Said the larkspur would be the signal for this theft. I'd have to deliver, or else. And here is an illustration that says the thief pulled the glass door open. I like the illustration. Looks good. There's a Mrs. Eldridge being held prisoner there too, said Nancy. Did you see her? Eldridge, Morgan repeated. I think I heard the name, but... Suddenly he broke off. Listen, there they are. The sound of a low whistle came from outside. Nancy flew to the switch and snapped off the light in the crystal case. I'll close it, Morgan whispered. The door clicked shut. What shall I do? He stammered. Listen, Nancy said quickly. We'll have to get them in here. I have a trap set, but you must go out and tell the men you need help, that you're too weak to carry all the loot. They never believe me. I'm no good at acting. There must be some way to get them in here, Nancy declared. Suppose you just don't go out. Morgan gave a bitter laugh. They'll go away, and then in a day or so I'll disappear and never come back. Thorne will see to that. He won't stand for any double-cross. Nancy had an idea. Come with me. She led the way into the hall. At once the kitchen door opened. What's up? George whispered. Where's the gang? Nancy drew Morgan into the dark kitchen and explained to the girls. But I've thought of a way to lure the gang into the house, she said. If they find out I wasn't injured and am still working on this case, they'll come after me. Bess caught her breath. You don't mean you'd let them know? Morgan will tell them, said Nancy. Bess, you stay here and George will take over the door of the TV room. I'll go out with Morgan. If they don't believe him, I'll let them see me and then run in here. That should do it. No, said the houseman. I won't let you, Miss Drew. Adam Thorne is dangerous. He'll stop at nothing. It's too big a risk for you. I'm not afraid, said Nancy. Suddenly, Morgan darted away and ran through the utility room. Nancy dashed after him, calling, Morgan, come back! No, he called. I'm telling Thorne I won't do it. I don't care what happens to me. Nancy raced outside and grasped the panting man. "Thorn," he called, "I won't do it!" "Morgan!" Nancy cried frantically. "Come inside!" An instant later, powerful hands gripped Nancy's shoulders and swung her away from the houseman. She reeled and fell backward in the darkness. Nancy struck the gravel driveway hard and blacked out. That is the end of chapter 13, and that's a good place to stop. And in the next stream, we will finish the book. I think we can definitely do that. Nancy looks like Steve. She did kind of look like Steve, didn't she? Yeah, she did. I don't think it'll focus, but there's Steve. That would be a good emo, actually. Okay, so I gotta go pick Keegan up, but okay, I made it for streaming for an hour. I think I only read about 45 minutes, but I was glad I could stream briefly. I don't really get the chance to stream much anymore, but I'd like to do more. So I'll just say I'll plan on streaming again Thursday. That should be fine. I'll let you know about a time. I will, CJ. I'll tell him hi. I'll let him know about, or I'll let you guys know about a time for Thursday, and then after that, depending on how much time I have, I would like to start reading The Nutcracker as told by Alexander Dumas? I don't know. Anyways, that will be our special holiday reading time for December, and I think it'll be fun. I've started reading it, and I can imagine reading it out loud, and I just thought it would be fun. So, thank you all for being here. I hope you have a good evening, and I'll plan on seeing you Thursday. Okay, bye.